in the World Trade Center. The building was hit by something. I don't know if I'm going to get out, but I love you very much. I hope I'll see you later. Bye.
From his words, I knew that Ken survived the impact of the plane. So I tried to call him back, but there was no answer. I fell to my knees in a panic, still clutching the telephone. I watched the TV in utter horror as black smoke billowed out from the building through a gaping hole the size of an airplane. I knew that Kenny was in that building. I watched as the people ran from the World Trade Center, hoping for a glimpse of my husband. Then the second tower was hit. Our lives were forever changed. My children would never again see their father, and I was now a widow. The grieving was just beginning. For me, one horribly sad question had been answered, but many more questions would soon follow.
We could see New York City and the smoke from the fires. Our prayers and thoughts go out to all the people there and everywhere else. Here I'm looking up and down the East Coast to see if I can see anything else.
Well, it's an absolute scene of pandemonium here. I'm across the street from the Pentagon.
Live coverage of the explosions at the World Trade Center.
This is believed to be the largest terrorist attack in history.
It has been a scene of chaos all morning.
The news media are not being told where Air Force One will head next.
The Pentagon is now being evacuated.
Airports all across the country are not allowing planes to take off.
Congressional leaders have been transferred to a secret location.
There was a collapse.
A section of the World Trade Center has collapsed onto the street below.
Nobody knows how many casualties.
We are not exactly sure at the moment of the whereabouts of the Secretary of Defense.
Flights headed for the United States are being sent to Canada.
Some senators have described this as a second Pearl Harbor.
We are told there are casualties at the Pentagon.
This has got to have been planned for at least a year.
It really is a day of infamy.
And all of a sudden, it is midnight in downtown Manhattan.
Smoke continues to billow out of lower Manhattan.
I can't see that second tower.
We heard the building coming down, and that's what we were running from.
Both of them simply imploding in on themselves.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
The terrorist wins when he or she manages to alter the behavior of a people or infringes on the way of life in a country, that the country, a democratic country particularly, alters its way of life. It raises the whole question of civil liberties and access and freedom of movement.
Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice.
The President assured us that he would bring those responsible to justice. We were told they hated us because America is a beacon of freedom and opportunity to the world. The U.S. government told us that Muslim fanatics took America by surprise and that this justified the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Patriot Act, and an unending war on terror. That to defend our freedom and protect us from this new threat, we must sacrifice the civil liberties for which we were attacked and abandon the protections provided us by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. What happens if the foundation these policies were built on begins to collapse?
Somebody very wise once said that a fact is the point at which we have agreed to allow the investigation to stop. Our investigation will stop at some point soon. Now, that doesn't mean that we will have discovered all of the facts, but we'll do our level best to conclude the investigative part of this and to report to the American people what we have found.
I really think it's a shame that the family members can't just grieve for the loss of their loved ones, that they have to fight every day the government.
You think with such a major catastrophic event, we'd be a little bit closer to the truth, and we're still not. And what's even worse is the more we ask the hard questions, the more we're attacked.
There's enough reason to think that there is a very good chance that there was prior complicity in this, in the sense of opening the door in the way of a Reichstag fire.
9/11 has been used as a justification for foreign and domestic policies that in many cases the public as a whole has not called for, doesn't agree with.
The American people have proved to be amazingly tolerant. They have not gotten terribly upset about the fact that they were deliberately lied to go to war in Iraq. They are tolerant of a number of other horrible things that they have learned about. There is one thing they will not tolerate. If the truth about 9/11 is revealed, it will reveal the values on which this American global domination project is built.
As monstrous as the forces appear to be ranged against us, everything is subject to change, and the change issues out of us.
This is serious. There's some very important questions here that are unanswered.
Years after 9/11 witnessed a clash of theories about the attacks. As more people became skeptical, the battle of perspectives headed for an open showdown.
What's your point today? What do you want to accomplish today?
My point is,
I wanted you to go down there and look for your own family members.
9/11 isn't true.
Crap.
It wasn't.
This isn't true right here.
No, it's just
tell me that's fake.
Why?
Tell me that's
why
fake.
It happened and who was responsible.
Okay.
The U.S. government.
It's not about blaming America first.
The U.S. government. The 9/11 was the U.S.'s Reichstag fire.
Crap. I'm going to go and watch your words. Keep speaking, but you better tell the truth. And all you're doing is bringing crap against America. What do you think we're doing right as a nation? Because obviously the CIA is
Here's the thing.
Here's
the thing. Our definition of patriot is a little bit different. I believe.
What are we doing
I believe that we should be patriots. As opposed to, obviously, someone. I think we should be patriots, not blind nationalists.
Oh, come on.
Not blind nationalists.
We got
Thomas Paine said, Thomas Paine said, the true duty of a patriot
anybody in Iraq
is to defend.
My baseball team is out there.
And I want to get every one of them back.
What do you mean by patriot?
The true duty of a patriot is to defend his country What do you mean? From its government. What do you mean by someone who speaks the truth when their government is doing the wrong thing? 9/11 is not the truth. Someone who speaks the truth, especially here. Especially here. We've got to take 9/11 back.
A 1,000 workmen removed 164 outdated buildings. Miles of telephone cables, pneumatic tubes, gas, steam, water, and sewer lines were relocated or removed. In 1969, from 70 feet below street level, the first tower rose toward its 1,350-foot destination. The unique tower design permitted many building activities normally accomplished in sequence to take place at the same time. Large open areas free of columns are a major feature of the tower buildings. Closely spaced vertical columns provide the load-bearing strength instead of the customary interior steel skeleton. In late 1970, the last piece of steel for the tower was hoisted over a quarter mile into position atop New York's tallest building. The North Tower of the World Trade Center was topped out in December 1970. The South Tower was completed in 1971.
Professor Stephen E. Jones conducted his PhD research at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center in California and earned his PhD in physics from Vanderbilt University in 1978. Jones specializes in metal-catalyzed fusion, solar energy, and archaeometry, which utilizes advanced physics methods to determine what happened in the past from available evidence. It is this approach that Jones applies in pursuing 9/11 research.
As I looked into it for myself, I realized, wait a minute, there must be other examples if fires brought these buildings down. There were no examples. And even here, I get this argument from civil engineers, fires are sufficient, I say, well, give me some examples then, because these buildings, we have over 100 years of history now of these steel frame buildings. And I read that nearly every one of them in their lifetime has a fire, major fire. There had been a huge inferno in a building in Spain. And you could see it 24 hours, burning, burning, burning. The people thought it was going to collapse because the World Trade Centers buildings had collapsed. It did not. And you look at it and the steel beams and all concrete, sure, it was damaged dramatically, but the structure is there, the frame is still there. And that's the case in all other buildings, the structure remains. So I thought, that is really strange. We need to look at the evidence, the structural steel. If somehow that failed due to fire, we really want to know. This has never happened before in a high-rise steel frame building. So let's get the steel. And there were a number of people who said, we need to do a forensic analysis. We need to start putting it together, figuring out just how these connections, how the columns failed. What's going on? We have to understand this. There's many buildings like this, hundreds of buildings like this, we've got to understand so that this doesn't happen again.
3 government reports were released: the well-known 9/11 Commission report, the NIST report, and the FEMA BPAT report.
It was totally inadequate. The BPAT study was, for the size of this disaster, I mean, these are the two largest buildings in the world as far as the Twin Towers go, two of the largest buildings in the world to collapse, and yet we were throwing at it volunteer engineers with no money and no authority, basically.
The only access they had was one guide, they described as a guided tour. They didn't even look at a single piece until like a month after the attack.
There was no NIST investigation. There was no $16 million. There was no federal look at this disaster other than the federal BPAT, and that's why we're very critical to BPAT. Again, not the individuals conducting it, but the way it was being conducted. It was, again, failed, to do what really needed to be done, and it stopped very short of what this disaster deserves.
It's a very well-designed building. Leslie Robertson and those gentlemen did a good job designing it, actually. It's not hollow. I get that argument from some people. They say, well, it's hollow, it's just weird. It's like a can, a soda pop can. No, it's got these huge core columns going up the center. This huge antennas, about 350 feet tall, is sitting on the core columns.
Kevin Ryan was a former manager for Environmental Health Laboratories, a water testing subsidiary of Underwriter Laboratories, or UL. UL certified the original World Trade Center steel and performed steel tests for the NIST report. Months after being promoted to site manager of his division, Kevin Ryan was fired for publicly questioning the NIST draft report released in October of 2004.
They were given an award in 1971 by the American Society of Civil Engineers as being the greatest engineering achievement, the greatest contribution to engineering in mankind. The American Society of Civil Engineers, right? So these were very well built buildings. John Skilling was given another award around about then by the AISC group, the American Institute of Steel Constructors. So these were award-winning buildings and award-winning engineers. John Skilling said he took all this airplane impacts and jet fuel fires into account and that the building structure would still be there. And the reason I believe he said that is these were totally over-designed for calamities. Obviously you're building these super high buildings that at the time the tallest buildings ever built. And they took into account aircraft impacts and jet fuel fires in their design.
With me is one of the architects who helped to design the World Trade Center, Aaron Swirsky.
Each floor by itself, it's sort of like an hermetic unit. It was designed even like for fire, that there were shutters that would shut off the ducts, the vertical openings, and that the fire couldn't travel from one floor to the other. Now that this collapsed, it's really an incredible thing.
It looked on the footage, what I saw on CNN, that the plane flew straight into the building.
Straight through him, right. Yeah.
So you're saying that the building was actually designed to cope with a hole like that and still survive?
Yeah, it was designed like that. Yeah, that's what happened. It was the explosion in 1993. If you remember that it opened a big hole in the structure, but it was at the end of the structure, and at that point the intent was to topple the building, to collapse, but because of the design it didn't collapse. But now I mean it's unbelievable. I don't know, it's just it was designed like to withstand something like that, and that's incredible because the entire design of the building was designed around that eventuality that an accident may occur.
The planes that crashed into the towers were 767-200s, and sometimes those are called jumbo jets. Well, they're actually not much bigger than the original plane that was in existence when the towers were built, which was a 707-340. They're actually fairly comparable. A 767 is slightly heavier than a 707. It has only a slightly higher fuel capacity, and a 767 has a cruising speed that is only 530 as opposed to 607 for a 707. Now, kinetic energy goes up with the square of velocity, so a typical crash event of a 707 would actually involve more kinetic energy, and the planes that crashed into the towers didn't have anywhere near their full fuel load. They only had about 10,000 gallons, according to official estimates. You have an event that's well within the design parameters of the building, and then the official story has that these buildings turned into dust and small pieces of shredded steel as a result of that.
Hyman Brown, the construction manager of the Twin Towers, said they were over-designed to withstand almost anything, including hurricanes, bombings, and an airplane hitting them. And even Thomas Eager, an MIT professor of materials and engineering science who supports the official theory, says that the impact of the airplanes would not have been significant because the number of columns lost on the initial impact was not large, and the loads were shifted to remaining columns in this highly redundant structure. Likewise, the NIST report, in discussing how the impact of the airliners played a role, focuses primarily on the claim that the planes dislodged a lot of the fireproofing material from the steel.
The floor assemblies were covered with fireproofing, the columns were covered with fireproofing. The fireproofing was actually undergoing an upgrade. NIST's report comes right out and says, if it weren't for fireproofing loss, forget all the impacts, forget the fires, we had to have widely dislodged fireproofing or these buildings would never have collapsed. So they need to have all the fireproofing stripped off.
2 1/4.
I pointed out that earlier calculations showed that the energy simply was not there. But NIST did these really weak and deceptive tests. Well, they slipped this Appendix C into one of the reports in the end. And this shows this little assembly, this plywood box, and they have a shotgun. They took this shotgun and they shot 15 blasts at non-representative samples, ultimately, and showed that where they shot the fireproofing would blow off. Okay. One of the big problems with that is, first of all, there's no energy for any of this to happen. Secondly, there's no evidence that 767 could transform into thousands of shotgun blasts, pointing in all different directions, by the way. Going through the core of the building, coming around to the outside, shooting all the insulation off, right underneath the floors, over several floors, let alone 9 floors, for crying out loud. I mean, it's just not possible. And so it's very deceptive. The fireproofing could not have been widely dislodged because there was no energy and there's no mechanism to do so.
So the official theory of the collapse is essentially a fire theory. So it cannot be overemphasized that fire has never caused large steel frame buildings to collapse. Never. Whether before 9/11 or after 9/11 or on 9/11 anywhere else in the world except allegedly New York City.
Initially, you had news reports saying, well, this was the plane, the jet fuel melted the steel, and somehow that steel then ends up in a pool. Well, first of all, that won't explain Building 7, which wasn't hit by a plane. Yeah. No plane, no jet fuel. Okay. So where'd the molten metal come from?
There had been some metallurgy tests done by Frank Gale. He was a member of the NIST team. He was the leader of Project 4 out of 8 projects, which was a study of the metallurgy, it was the analysis of the steel. These tests that had been done on the steel samples, the few steel samples that had been saved, one of them was a paint deformation test that Frank Gale's group had done. And it showed how paint would curl or change in a certain temperature range. And so they took these samples and they analyzed them to see what temperatures they might have been exposed to by looking at the paint. Less than 2% of these samples, which had been pulled specifically from the fire zones, and they even said despite pre-collapse exposure to fire, less than 2% of them had seen temperatures of 480 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very low relative to the temperatures needed to soften or melt steel.
These fires, it doesn't matter if it's diesel fuel, office materials, including paper, or jet fuel, they aren't hot enough to melt steel, these structural steel beams. To melt it requires 1,500 approximately 1530 centigrade, about 2800 Fahrenheit. You can't heat the steel long enough with these fires to melt it.
The problem with floors not collapsing was a big one, because that's really where all the experts were hanging their hat on, this pancake theory.
There are people who've looked at this and said, well, you see, what happened was that the floors got hot, they would sag and pull away from the core and start collapsing.
There were articles coming out in like Newsday from New York that said, well, these floor models didn't fail in the furnaces. You know, they all passed the test for 2 hours. 2 hours, of course, is longer than either of the buildings stood. That was a red flag for me, right? And then I was even more interested in reading this report. You can't have pancaking without floor collapse. In October 2004, when the Popular Science magazine article came out that NIST scientists jumped on board and supported, they were still talking about pancaking, right? That was in early 2005. And that all contradicts the UL floor model tests. None of the samples actually had reached temperatures that would show that the steel might have lost half of its strength. The summary that talked about steel softening and buckling, that directly contradicts Frank Gale's results. The temperatures that were seen by the steel samples were not high enough to soften or melt any kind of steel, even unfireproof steel. So those were the kind of questions that I was asking Frank Gale about, trying to get answers on. I really felt, honestly, that he was going to give me a response. I thought he was going to say, wow, you're right, you know, or well, this is why they're still talking about this. He never responded to me.
Somewhere about 34th Street or something, I look at a TV and inside one of those appliance stores, I saw the Trade Center fell down. I go, wow, look at that. So I kept on walking. It was so chaotic here. I just walk right in. I didn't even have my press pants with me or anything. Just walk right in, you know. And both towers had fallen down by that point. But I really had nothing. I mean, it was an unprecedented event. So I had no idea like what I was going to see when I got there. I thought there would be like, you know, a tree fell over kind of thing. You see the stump or something or whatever. I don't know what this was. But when there was nothing there at all, basically it was all flat. It was just mind-boggling.
Now, the pancake theory requires intact concrete, a lot of mass, hitting the next floor, and then those two hit the next floor, you see? And so you would expect then from that theory, which is the official theory, as the floors pancake, you'd expect to see a whole stack of floors piled up on top of each other after the collapse is completed. Instead of a whole stack of floors, and then a spindle of the core column standing too, what you see is dust that's being produced. Now you can't have it both ways. In other words, if there's dust being produced, where's the mass that causes the collapse? And if there's a mass in the collapse, that every time one floor hits a stationary floor, or a set of floors hits a stationary floor, that'll slow the collapse down. The mass has to move out of the way to get the collapse to be rapid. In a way, it's like records on a spindle. And one record falls, and If it has enough force, it will knock the next record and the next and the next. Besant and Zhu looked at this, and they said, well, you have to have half the columns fail about the same time. There's 47 steel, huge, 3 feet at the base, steel columns going up the core. 47, they're interconnected. How do you get them to fail simultaneously so the core disappears? In the FEMA report, they said, well, if you look at the videos, that tower, this antenna tower, drops before the rest of the building starts to collapse. And I looked at the data too. It does. It drops about a dozen feet before, which is, quite a drop. And then things start happening down below where the plane went in. But the plane did not cut all those core columns. The building stood for quite a while, so it's not like it was just ready to tip over or something, which is what you'd expect, by the way, if you cut some on the side. It looks like those core columns were pulled, cut. The support was gone from the core first, and that is the way demolitions typically proceed.
A 50-plus story section of the North Tower core remained standing after the collapse. This is what you would expect from the pancake theory. But watch what happens next. The core does not tip over, rather it collapses down upon itself, as if the entire structure had been cut. You can even see gray smoke rising from the end of the steel.
Now what can do that? What can move mass out of the way? Explosives. Explosives cut those steel support columns, and they can also then, up above as there's explosives, produce dust.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground. I could be standing here and you could be standing there, and I could be describing to you, Governor, the site, and then a fire would break out in between us. And it was just by luck or the design of God that we weren't killed.
I started looking at the molten metal, you see. And to me, Mike, this is one area that had not been researched much before. All 3 buildings, both towers in the rubble, in the basement areas, and Building 7, there's these pools of molten metal.
This is how it's been since day one. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was the core at some point, and it looked like an oven. It was just roaring inside. And it just had a bright reddish orange color. See that stuff he's pulling out? What was that, Chief? We're gonna hold off on the water. See the stuff he's pulling out? Yeah. It's red hot. If we hit it too much steam, you won't be able to see what he's doing. Great.
So I'm looking through the official reports. What do they say about the molten metal? They say nothing. But wait a minute. This is important evidence. It's discussed by many people. Initially on the scene, you have people saying the molten metal is flowing down off the rubble. It's flowing down into these gigantic pools of molten metal now. I mean, it's flowing. It's not like it just formed somehow after the fact with fires, but it's molten right just very shortly after. And still flowing off the... So where'd that come from? Not from fires. We agree on that. Where did it come from? The only explanation I can find for that is exothermic chemical reactions. And the most notable suspect is a thermite reaction. It doesn't have to be thermite. There are other high temperature chemical reactions, but that's the most likely one. Thermite can be purchased on eBay, and many people, I show it in my class, physics, and I'll be showing it this fall in my physical science class. What we've got is a mixture of iron oxide, which provides the oxygen, and aluminum powder. A lot of that dust is aluminum oxide. You form aluminum oxide and molten iron. That's what the molten iron looks like. Notice the color there. It's a yellow-white hot, which would be easily 1,000 centigrade. It's around 2,500 Fahrenheit or so. It requires the oxide. It's the oxygen here that's held by the iron that allows this to go. And as we bump these together now, you'll have a reaction in which the aluminum picks up, steals the oxygen from the iron oxide, and the aluminum just grabs on that oxygen and produces a very high temperature reaction. And the result is jet fuel will not ignite that. That's one thing. But you get it to ignite with an arc, for example, or burning magnesium. It will ignite. This is just kind of a fun way to show on a small scale. The products are molten iron. Remember, all three buildings had molten metal. And aluminum oxide, which goes off primarily as a dust. You know those enormous dust clouds? You can imagine when you assemble these chemicals on a large scale, the amount of heat that you generate. People say, well, if there's explosives or something, okay, you've got your arguments, but where's the smoking gun? By analyzing this, we determined it is not molten aluminum from the plane, okay. Indeed, it contains a great deal of iron, which is the product of the thermite reaction. It's not just structural steel that somehow melted, no. It's very little chromium. But it does have sulfur and manganese and some other elements that are characteristic, you see. It's like a fingerprint that the criminal left behind. This carries with it evidence. How was this done? What was used? And I should explain real quickly. This particular, people ask me all the time, where'd you get this? Well, there's a woman, she read my paper. I'm calling for an investigation, particularly of this molten metal, and see what's going on. She immediately sent me this sample from this memorial to 9/11 and to the families, who I deeply sympathize with those families. So we checked this metal, and that's how we got it. And another sample like it, same characteristics, high in iron, manganese, fluorine.
The FEMA report acknowledges recovering 2 structural members with unusual erosion patterns in the World Trade Center debris field. Appendix C of the report looks at a limited metallurgical examination of these samples done by Jonathan Barnett, Ronald Biederman, and R.D. Sisson Jr. Here are their findings. Both samples contain significant levels of iron oxide and sulfur. The thinning of the steel occurred by a high-temperature corrosion due to a combination of oxidation and sulfidation. The sulfidation attack of steel grain boundaries accelerated the corrosion and erosion of the steel. In their suggestions for future research, FEMA acknowledges the severe corrosion and subsequent erosion of samples 1 and 2 are a very unusual event. No clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified. A detailed study into the mechanisms of this phenomenon is needed to determine what risk, if any, is presented to existing steel structures exposed to severe and long-burning fires.
NBC's Pat Dawson is close to the scene of that attack. Pat?
Moments ago, I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. Chief Albert Turry told me that he received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. He tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place. And then an hour after the first hit here, with the first crash that took place, he said, there was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
Shortly after 9/11, the New York Fire Department recorded over 500 oral histories in which firefighters and emergency medical workers recounted their experiences of that day. Mayor Bloomberg's administration refused to release these oral histories. But the New York Times, joined by several families of the 9/11 victims, filed suit. And after a very long process, the city was ordered by the New York Court of Appeals to release these oral histories. The Times then made these oral histories available. These oral histories contain many dozens of testimonies that speak of explosions and related phenomena characteristic of controlled demolition. Several people reported a single explosion followed by collapse of one tower or the other. Many people reported multiple explosions. Paramedic Kevin Darnowski said, "I heard 3 explosions, and then Tower 2 started to come down." Firefighter Thomas Turilli said, "It almost sounded like bombs going off, like boom, 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 like 7 or 8. Craig Carlson said that he and other firefighters heard explosions coming from the South Tower. There were about 10 explosions. We then realized the building started to come down. Firefighter Joseph Mayola said, "It looked like the building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops." Paramedic Daniel Rivera also mentioned pops. Asked how he knew the South Tower was coming down, he said, "It was a frigging noise. At first I thought it was, do you ever see professional demolition where they set the charges on certain floors and then you hear pop, 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 pop? That's what I thought it was."
Who's involved in the secondary explosion at Tower 1K? I've got 5 patients. They need to be treated.
Firefighter Edward Kachia said it actually gave at a lower floor, not the floor where the plane hit. We originally had thought that there was like an internal explosion.
We got another explosion on the tower, 1013 thereafter. Because of the secondary explosion, we've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion.
Assistant Commissioner Stephen Gregory said, "I thought before number 2 came down that I saw low-level flashes. I saw a flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building?"
Tower 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area. Marine 610, we were notified, Kate.
Captain Karen DeShore said, "Somewhere around the middle there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially it was just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode."
I got an eyewitness who said there was an explosion on floor 7-8. That's Tower 2.
Firefighter Richard Benasiski, speaking of the South Tower, said, "There was just an explosion. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings. It seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions." Deputy Commissioner Thomas Fitzpatrick said, "It looked like sparkling around one specific layer of the building. My initial reaction was that this was exactly the way it looks when they show you these implosions on TV." A few witnesses spoke of horizontal ejections. Chief Frank Crothers said, "There was what appeared to be an explosion. It appeared at the very top, simultaneously from all 4 sides. Material shot out horizontally, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse." This testimony is very important because the official theory says that the horizontal ejections were produced when the floors collapsed and pushed the materials out. So listen to firefighter James Curran, who said, "I looked back and I heard like every floor went choo, choo, choo. I looked back and from the pressure, everything was getting blown out of the floors before it actually collapsed." If all these firefighters and medical workers witnessed all these phenomena suggestive of controlled demolition, it might be wondered why they have not spoken out. Part of the answer is probably provided by Auxiliary Lieutenant Fireman Paul Isaac. Having said that there were definitely bombs in those buildings, Isaac added that many other firemen know there were bombs in the buildings, but they're afraid for their jobs to admit it because the higher-ups forbid discussion of this fact. Isaac, for example, has more recently said, "I know 9/11 was an inside job. The police know it's an inside job, and the firemen know it too. But you have not heard this on the nightly news."
Building 7 looked like a building that was like on fire, and the fire engine guys would come and they put their ladder up and they come with the water and they'll be out. It didn't. I've seen many, many fires. It covered lots of fires, man. It didn't look to me, it wasn't a 47-story building that was engulfed in flames. The whole building wasn't on fire, but I mean, you know, there was a lot of fire coming out of a few of the floors. At that time, I had no idea whether steel buildings fall down when they're on fire or not. I mean, what do I know about this stuff? So the fire guy says, well, that building's going to come down. I said, oh, yeah, really? When do you think it'll come down? So he said, I don't know, tonight or tomorrow morning. It must have been about 5:15 in the afternoon by then. I walked about almost to where the corner of where church is now. And then I heard this rumble. I looked back, and the thing fell down, you know, like fast. Number 7 fell down.
Gone, man.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
I was amazed. It follows, and I'd look now at dozens of demolitions just to see what they look like, what is the nature, is experiments on how you bring a building down symmetrically, straight down and rapidly. You knock out the core first, the core goes down, the sidewalls lean in a little bit, and the building comes down rapidly because you've knocked out the support. Well, that's exactly how Building 7 came down. The dramatic collapse of World Trade Center 7 is something everyone ought to see. I suspect that few have actually looked at it to date. It's very dramatic. It would be helpful actually to show a demolition of some other building, which we know is controlled demolition. So you can see how it dips in the middle and comes straight down and rapidly. And also you see coming off the sides these jets of gas and debris, smoke puffing out of there. And that's very typical of explosive demolition. All these characteristics, the straight down fall and the rapid fall. And then you would look at, for comparison, Building 7, and you can see what I mean. It really does look like an explosive demolition. Something that needs to be explored very carefully, but the characteristics are there. So you look at the building, you see it dip in the middle first, and the sides bow in a little bit, and then you see it come down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just like that. And right down onto its footprint. You see, that's the goal of controlled demolition. You don't want the building to tip over, which is much easier to do with explosives, actually. Just knock out the supports and let her tip. The trusses in the building made it very asymmetrical. There were 24 central columns, steel columns. And for those to fail in such a way that that building would collapse in the center first and then come straight down, instead of toppling over, for instance, no.
The entire roofline cascades downward neatly into its own footprint. At the same time, jets of debris can be seen shooting out of the walls and going up floor by floor. After viewing this video, NIST can simply declare, NIST has seen no evidence that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was caused by bombs, missiles, or controlled demolition.
In the FEMA report, I think they were fairly honest. And it's interesting as you read what they said about Building 7. So, I'm reading with great interest. At the end, they say, well, our best hypothesis. Now, this is the fire and damage hypothesis. That's the only hypothesis they looked at seriously. Okay, so our best hypothesis, they said, has only a low probability of occurrence. And I'm saying, that's right. That's exactly right. Why don't you quantify that? But they didn't quantify it. But they did admit, it has only a low probability of occurrence, and that's to their credit. The 9/11 Commission didn't even mention Building 7 collapse,
NIST and FEMA published pictures of damage to the southwest wall at the 18th floor and minor roof damage. The NAST chart of the damages shows a substantial gouge in the south face from the 10th floor to the ground, affecting 3 of the structural columns. Here begin the problems in the NIST preliminary report on the collapse of World Trade Center 7. The first column to collapse is said to be column number 80, which was untouched by the structural damage. This is evident in the fall of the east penthouse, supported by column number 80. This precedes global collapse, but what happens next is not so easily explained. The building does not fall over in the direction of the gouging damage, and it does not fall over in the direction of the failed column beneath the east penthouse. Now, it is one thing to dispute the controlled demolition hypothesis. It is another to pretend that these pictures do not suggest it at all. Shot at about 9 p.m. on September 11th. According to the FEMA report, the debris field radius was approximately 70 feet. The U.S. Post Office is on the left, also known as the Federal Office Building. World Trade Center 7 stopped at the sidewalk along the post office. Yet the post office suffered very little damage. It was less than half the height of Building 7, which was 570 feet tall. You can see Building 5 still burning in the distance.
My argument is it needs to be investigated. There is another hypothesis here, staring us in the face, of explosive demolition. And okay, you have the hypothesis of fire, but the official reports don't analyze this other possibility of explosive demolition. That is strange. Scientifically, I say it's a viable hypothesis. They look at just the one, and I'm saying good science requires us to consider other hypotheses, in particular the explosive demolition hypothesis. Let's study it out. Let's debate it scientifically. Let's put it on the table, for heaven's sakes. There's a lot at stake here to understand what caused the collapse of these buildings. We should be able to discuss it dispassionately as scientists. It's hard to do, but we should be able to do that.
Coming up, were pre-positioned explosives behind the collapse of the Twin Towers on 9/11? We'll talk to a BYU University professor who says Muslims probably not to blame for bringing down the buildings after all, when the situation returns.
Tucker Carlson, one of his associates, emailed me early in the day. This was a Monday, I remember, and asked me what would I like to show. And I said, well, in particular, I wanted to show this video clip which shows the collapse of Building 7. We've talked a lot about that, and it's what I wanted to discuss. The building collapsed about 5:21 p.m. on the afternoon of September 11th, 2001. But since then, it has not been shown on the media that I know of. The towers, yes, over and over and over, and it's the Muslim hijackers that brought down over and over, we're told that. But Building 7, no, so I asked if them to show this actual collapse and some photos of Building 7, before especially, so you could see what it looked like, this huge 47-story tower or skyscraper. Now, during the interview, I could not see what everybody else saw. I only had a camera pointing at me, so I had to ask Tucker, well, let's look at the collapse of Building 7. Have you shown it yet? I asked him that 2 or 3 times, and finally said, no, we're not showing that clip. And I said, well, what are we going to discuss then? Let's talk about the molten metal, okay? And I did, then proceed to talk about the molten metal. But he would not show the collapse that. Now, of course, he didn't explain why. He just didn't show the collapse of Building 7. But that was a big surprise to me, because that was what I had asked them. They asked me, what do you want to show? This is it. And then let's look at the collapse of that building. I've looked at the official reports by FEMA and so on regarding the collapse of these buildings.
Right.
I'd like to look at the collapse of Building 7 in just a minute. It was not even hit by a jet, so we should look at that one.
The 2 towers, the explanation has been that the fire inside was so intense that it weakened the structural steel and that each floor collapsed down upon the next in a pancake fashion, and they imploded in on themselves. Is that essentially, I think, what people think?
Yeah, that's basically it, yeah. And so what I've done is to analyze these reports. But I would like to do a little experiment with you, Tucker, if I could. I sent out a video clip of the collapse of Building 7, because most people haven't actually seen that one, and that's the crux of the argument that I'm presenting.
To sum up very quickly the argument for us, you believe there were explosives in the buildings planted by someone, detonated.
Well, yeah.
Is that correct?
In other words, the hypothesis to be tested is there's 2 hypotheses here. One is fire and damage caused all 3 buildings to collapse.
Okay.
The other is that explosives in the buildings may have caused the collapse. And so then we analyze and see which fits the data better. And I've done that in my 25-page paper. I'm not going to let you off the hook. I really want to do this experiment with you to look at the collapse of Building 7.
We don't have a lot of time for experiments, Professor, but if you could just give us one thing to hold on to. How you make these claims or appear to make these claims. Do you have any evidence that there were bombs in the building?
Sure. Let's start with the collapse of Building 7. Can you roll the video clip that I sent to you?
Okay, I'm not sure if we can, but to specify, that is World Trade Center building number 7.
Try it.
Smaller than the other 2, was not hit by a plane, of course, yet it collapsed.
Right. It's 47 stories.
That's right.
24 steel columns in the center.
Right.
Trusses asymmetrically supported. Now, I can't see what you're seeing, so are you rolling that?
No, we just see the building.
Although the September 11th attacks were almost 5 years ago and the 9/11 Commission report has been released for some time now, some folks are still asking questions about what happened that day. A Zogby poll commissioned just last month by 911truth.org found that a whopping 42% of Americans think the government and the 9/11 Commission are covering something up.
As far as I'm aware, the only show to play a clip of Building 7 collapsing was Scarborough Country. After what happened on MSNBC's Tucker Carlson show, I asked them to guarantee that they would play the clip. They agreed to do so only after the producer obtained approval from the vice president of all programming at NBC. A month later, CNN Headline News' Glenn Beck show refused to play a clip of Building 7. The decision to play the clip has to come from the very top.
Why won't media show World Trade Center 7? Why won't the media show World Trade Center 7? Why won't the media show World Trade Center 7? The 9/11 family members who did not accept the victim compensation money continued to seek answers through the judicial system.
I respect the law very much, and I think the rights of the ordinary citizen are extremely important and should not be simply trampled on and forgotten because of the size of the event, and that's what I feel like is happening. We have a civil justice system that should be in place for me to get answers that I need.
As of yet, they have not had their day in court. Were cases for demolitions to be tried in a court of law, this may be the summation that you would hear.
Now you know some things about physics. Those towers collapsed at free fall speed. Not quite 15 seconds. The law of conservation of momentum would have predicted about 45 seconds had there in fact been resistance to the collapse at each floor. But there was no resistance. Because the only explanation for the first 3 steel frame buildings in the history of mankind to collapse as a result of fire, all on the same day, all in the same place, all at free fall speed, all diving symmetrically into their own footprint, ladies and gentlemen, has nothing to do with fire, but was in fact a controlled demolition. World Trade Center 7. Some of you didn't even know that there was a 3rd building that had collapsed that day. But now you know. And you look at the penthouse just as it's about to fall, and that is the first thing that collapses. Ten times the amount of dust that could be explained by the gravitational pull of a collapsing, burning building of whatever size. 10 times. There was that steel frame building in Philadelphia. It's still there. The testimony of the firefighters, the police officers, battalion chiefs standing right there on the sidewalk outside of the building, hearing explosions. That's evidence. That is evidence. The molten metal in the basement of the ruins can only be explained by explosives. That is evidence. The infrared satellite photographs taken weeks afterwards of Ground Zero, where you see hot spots well in excess of 1,000 degrees weeks after. The photographs admitted into evidence here of the orange to red hot pieces of steel being carried off by these machines is evidence. Their job was to explain to us why the World Trade Center towers collapsed. That was their job. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity in this report, this sequence is referred to as probable collapse sequence, although it does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. It's still standing up there, ladies and gentlemen. Well, brevity, that is cover-up. Evidence of the truth, evidence of mass murder by this government, evidence of the absence and failure of democracy in this country.
The Twin Towers were attacked in part for their symbolism, but their collapse has come to have a new significance in the post-9/11 world. When those towers came crashing down, they took with them the very foundation of our Constitution and the structure of our republic for more than 200 years. We either live constitutionally, or else those who exercise official power do so unjustifiably and must be removed. There can be no disputing the facts. We have lost important constitutional protections against invasion of privacy, the right to dissent, and arbitrary search and seizure. Taking away these essential protections has not made us any safer. Thomas Jefferson once said, "When the people fear their government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty." Dorothy Thompson, a prominent journalist, political commentator, and a leading opponent of Hitler and 1930s fascism, stated, "When liberty is taken away by force, it can be restored by force. When it is relinquished voluntarily, by default, it can never be recovered." You know what you have to do. 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 You know what you have to do.